Devereaux Knight had a reputation that didn't need an introduction. The Ghost King of Chicago. Brilliant, ruthless, cold as the lake in January. 3 secretaries before Marlowe had lasted a combined total of 11 days. Marlowe had a reputation, too, though hers was the kind people forgot to mention. She showed up 4 minutes early, never filed the same document twice, and had learned, young and hard, to keep her face a closed book. They might have stayed exactly what they were, employer and employee, 2 people occupying the same expensive air, but corridors are narrow in a 32nd floor fortress, and a woman who spent years keeping herself very still will sometimes, only sometimes, hold her breath when a door opens. Devereaux noticed everything. "Hello, my beautiful family. Welcome back, or if this is your very first time here, welcome home. I'm so glad you found your way to this little corner of the internet. Before we dive in, I just want to check in with you. How are you really doing? I hope today was kind to you. And if it wasn't, if it was one of those days that just took everything, I hope this story gives you somewhere soft to land for a little while. That's what we do here. We slow down. We breathe. We let someone else's story carry us for a moment. If you're new, take a second to like and subscribe. It means more than you know. It's genuinely the only reason these stories keep coming to life. And please, say hello in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing you're out there. Now, put the day down. Get comfortable, grab something warm or something sweet, and let's go somewhere beautiful together. Today's story is waiting. The elevator opened at 7:56 a.m. and Marlowe Solstice stepped onto the 32nd floor like the building had been expecting her. She wore a deep navy blouse, a charcoal pencil skirt, and the particular kind of composure that isn't inherited. It's built, brick by careful brick, from every situation that once tried to unmake her. Her heels made no sound on the marble. She'd practiced that once, in a different life, for different reasons. The habit stayed. The outer office was enormous and deliberately cold, the kind of cold that wasn't a thermostat setting but a message. Floor-to-ceiling glass looked out over a Chicago morning that hadn't decided yet whether to be beautiful or punishing. 3 desks sat in a row along the east wall. Only one was meant for her. She knew which one without asking. It was the only one that faced the inner office door directly, which meant whoever sat there would spend the day in the peripheral vision of the man inside. Intentional. Everything here was intentional. She set her bag down, removed her notebook and one pen, and stood with her hands loosely clasped, surveying the room in the unhurried way of someone who has already decided not to be rushed. A woman named Petra, administrative coordinator, according to the email chain, appeared from a side corridor with the expression of someone who had been asked to deliver difficult news so many times that her face had simply settled into it permanently. "He knows you're here," Petra said, by way of greeting. "Good," said Marlowe. Petra glanced at the closed inner door, then back at Marlowe, and lowered her voice without fully meaning to. "He'll make you wait." The last one, Sophie, she knocked after 6 minutes. He didn't answer. She knocked again at 8. He told her through the door that people who knocked twice didn't last. Petra paused. She was gone by lunch. Marlowe looked at her pleasantly. "Thank you for that." She did not knock. She stood at parade rest in front of the closed door, not performing patience, simply exercising it, and she waited. Through the glass panels flanking the door she could see the shape of him at his desk. Not clearly. Just the dark geometry of a man built to occupy space. He had not looked up. 5 seconds. 10. She had grown up in a house where silence was rationed. Where speaking first meant losing. She had trained herself, over years, to find silence not threatening but useful, a diagnostic tool. Silence told you everything about the people inside it. It told you what they were afraid of, what they wanted, how long they'd practiced at power. She took a quiet breath and listened to his. 15 seconds. At 20, she noticed the faint scent of black coffee and something resinous, cedarwood, maybe, drifting from beneath the door. At 25, she noticed that the wall to her left held not art but a single sheet of paper framed in black steel. From where she stood, she couldn't read it. She filed the detail away. The door opened at 31 seconds. Not because he was ready. Because he had been watching the clock, same as her, and he was precise about his tests. The office beyond was vast and very dark for morning, the automated glass tinted to a deep gray blue that turned the city outside into something impressionistic, distant, stripped of noise. A desk of dark walnut sat at the center of the room like an altar. Bookshelves lined the north wall, but the books were not decorative, their spines were cracked, some bristling with paper markers, and they were not arranged by color or size but by some internal logic that she suspected made perfect sense once you understood the man. He sat with his elbows on the desk and his hands loosely steepled, and he did not look up. His presence filled the room the way pressure fills a sealed space, not loud, not demonstrative, just everywhere. His jaw was sharp, his shoulders broad beneath a dark jacket that had been made specifically for him, and there was a small cut at the corner of his mouth, barely healed, that she catalogued and did not comment on. She stepped inside. She stood. She did not speak. He let the silence go longer than she had expected, further than 30 seconds, further than a minute, pushing past the point where it becomes theatrical and into the territory where it becomes something else entirely. A negotiation without words. An audition where the role was not secretary, but something harder to name. She thought about the framed page in the corridor. She thought about Petra's face. She thought about 11 days across 3 women and decided, quietly, that he was not cruel, he was efficient. He was culling. She stayed exactly where she was. When he finally looked up, his eyes were the color of deep water and just as difficult to read. They moved over her face with the unhurried attention of a man who had never needed to pretend interest he didn't feel, which meant that right now, whatever he was feeling, it was real. He said nothing for another 3 seconds. She counted them. "You're late, Marlowe," he said. His voice was low and very level, the kind of voice that had learned not to rise because it had never needed to. It was a test. A small one, almost perfunctory, the kind you give when you've already run the harder tests in your head and you want to see if reality matches the simulation. She met his eyes without hurry. "I'm exactly 4 minutes early, Mr. Knight." She kept her voice steady, not defiant, simply factual, the way you'd correct a minor error in a document before it compounded. "And if you're waiting for me to flinch, you should know, you don't scare me." The silence that followed was a different species from the one before it. That one had been a weapon. This one was something closer to surprise, brief, controlled, and swiftly rearranged. A single line appeared at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one. He looked back down at his desk. "Close the door, Ms. Solstice," he said. "And sit down." She did both. She settled into the chair across from him, crossed one knee over the other, and opened her notebook to the first clean page. The city glittered gray and gold behind him. The silence in the room was different now, shared rather than weaponized, a thing they'd arrived at together, and she had the peculiar, disciplined sense of having just passed a test she hadn't studied for. Which was, she would later understand, exactly the kind Devereaux Knight preferred. The task arrived at 4:47 p.m., which was not an accident. Marlowe had spent the day learning the architecture of his empire the way she learned everything, quietly, methodically, without announcing what she was doing. She'd mapped the filing system in the first hour and found it deliberately labyrinthine, the kind of organized chaos that looked like negligence until you understood that it had been designed to be navigable by exactly one person. She reorganized nothing. She simply memorized it. By noon she understood the shape of his calendar. By 2 she had identified 3 scheduling conflicts his previous secretary had apparently never noticed, corrected them without comment, and left the updated itinerary on his desk while he was on a call. He hadn't acknowledged it. She hadn't expected him to. At 4:47, when the rest of the floor was beginning the particular kind of quiet shuffle that precedes an office emptying, his voice came through the intercom with the unhurried certainty of a man who did not track other people's clocks. "My office, Miss Solstice." She brought her notebook. She always brought her notebook. He was standing at the window when she entered, his back to her, hands in his pockets, watching the city begin its slow conversion from day to evening. The lake was visible from here on clear days, a dark seam at the edge of everything, the place where Chicago simply stopped and something vast and indifferent began. She had read once that the lake had no tides. That it moved only when forced to. She found, looking at Devereaux Knight from across the room, that she understood the comparison people made. He spoke without turning. "There's a contract," he said. "Voss Holdings. 14 pages. Missing a witness signature on the Third Amendment, which means it's non-binding, which means the property transfer it was designed to secure is currently in a state of elegant legal ambiguity." A pause. "The attorney who drafted it is in Geneva. The secondary counsel is unreachable. The notary who was present has retired to a town in rural Portugal with, apparently, no working telephone." He turned then, and looked at her with the measured patience of someone presenting a problem they've already decided is unsolvable. "I need that signature verified, located, and legally remedied by 7 a.m. I have a meeting at 7:15 that depends on it." Another pause, brief, pointed. "My last secretary suggested we postpone the meeting." The subtext was immaculate. He was not asking her to do the impossible. He was waiting to see what she would do when she believed she'd been handed it. Marlowe looked at him for exactly the length of time it took her to decide she would not give him the reaction he was calibrated for. Then she looked down at her notebook, wrote 4 words, Voss, Geneva, Portugal, notary, and looked back up. "I'll need access to the contract filing system and your external counsel directory." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. He had too much control for surprise to surface cleanly, but a recalibration. Subtle. The kind you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. She was watching for it. "Petra will give you access," he said. "Thank you." She turned to go. "Ms. Solstice." She stopped, but didn't turn immediately. A beat, not defiance, just refusal to be summoned like a reflex. Then she turned, unhurried. His eyes moved over her face with that same diagnostic attention from the morning. "My last 3 secretaries each lasted between 2 and 5 days, he said. The one before them lasted 3 weeks. She was the best of them. She left a note on her desk when she quit. Would you like to know what it said?" "Not particularly," said Marlowe. "It wouldn't change what I'm about to go do." The corner of his mouth moved. She was beginning to understand that this was the closest his face came to a full reaction. She left him at the window and went to work. The Portuguese town was called Alvito. Population, 700 and something. She found this out at 5:23 p.m. from a regional civil registry database she accessed through a chain of legal databases she wasn't entirely certain she had clearance for. The notary's name was Enrique Caldas. He was 71 years old. He had retired 4 years ago following a brief career in Lisbon's commercial property sector that overlapped, by exactly 18 months, with the early incorporation of Knight Holdings' European subsidiary. This was the thread she pulled. At 6:04 p.m. she located a secondary contact, a former colleague of Caldas, now practicing in Evora, who, after 11 minutes of a phone call conducted in her functional Portuguese and his excellent if rusty English, confirmed that Caldas had registered a landline telephone number with the local notarial board as a courtesy, and that the number was technically current, and that she was welcome to try it though she should know that Enrique kept irregular hours. At 6:31 p.m., Enrique Caldas answered his telephone on the 4th ring with the cautious energy of a man who rarely received calls and had developed a policy of treating them as potential inconveniences. By 6:38 p.m. Marlowe had established that he remembered the Voss contract, that he possessed his own records of the witnessing session, and that he was willing, given the appropriate legal framework, to provide a sworn affidavit of his participation that a retained counsel could use to remedy the signature gap. By 7:15 p.m. she had the external counsel's emergency line and a very tired junior attorney who, to his credit, asked the right questions quickly and confirmed that a sworn affidavit from the original notary, if properly apostilled, would satisfy the legal remedy under both Swiss and Illinois commercial law. She ordered the apostille process remotely at 9:02 p.m. through a document authentication service she'd used in her previous life, a life that, if anyone at Knight Holdings had read her file carefully enough, would have explained why she could do things like this at 9 p.m. on a first day of work without raising her heart rate. The floor was empty by 10. She worked in the outer office with one lamp on and the city doing its slow, glittering work outside the glass, and she found, in the particular silence of a building after hours, in the clean mechanical satisfaction of a problem unwinding, something close to peace. At 11:40 she became aware that the inner office light was still on. She had assumed he'd left. She revised the assumption and filed it under things about Devereux Knight that should not have surprised her. She did not knock. She did not speak. She simply continued working, and if there was a specific quality to her stillness now, a heightened attention, a faint recalibration of her own presence in the room, she did not examine it closely. At 1:17 a.m. she had everything. The affidavit. The apostille confirmation number. A one-page legal summary prepared by the junior attorney, whom she had kept on retainer via email for 4 hours, and who she suspected had not eaten dinner. She sent him a brief, professional thank you and meant it. She printed the full package. She walked to his door. She knocked once, one knock, unhurried, neither tentative nor declarative, and waited. Come in. He was still at his desk. His jacket was off. The cut at his mouth looked darker in the late light. He was reading something that he set down without marking his place, which told her either that he had memorized it or that her arrival mattered more than his page. She set the package on his desk. Voss Holdings, she said. Affidavit, apostille confirmation, legal summary. Your counsel can finalize by 6:30 if you send it tonight. You'll have everything you need for 7:15. She paused. The notary says hello, incidentally. He seemed to enjoy the conversation. Devereux looked at the package. He did not touch it immediately. He looked at it the way you look at something that has arrived ahead of schedule and reconfigured the schedule around itself. Then he looked at her, and this time the recalibration was not subtle at all. It moved through his expression slowly, like light changing on water, not warmth exactly, but the recognition of something that warranted a closer look. Sit down, Miss Solstice, he said, and his voice had a different texture than it had at 7:56 that morning. Still level. Still controlled. But something in it had made room. It arrived on a Thursday. Marlowe had been at Knight Holdings for 11 days, which, by the building's internal mythology, made her something of a phenomenon. Petra had stopped giving her the look of cautious pre-grief she reserved for new secretaries and had begun instead to give her a different look entirely, one that sat somewhere between professional respect and the particular relief of a woman who has been the only competent person in a room for too long and has finally been joined. The work had found its rhythm. Marlowe arrived at 7:56 each morning. She corrected, anticipated, reorganized, and translated, because a significant portion of her job, she had discovered, was translating Devereux Knight. Not his words, which were precise to the point of being surgical, but his silences, his half-finished directives, the documents he left on the corner of his desk at specific angles that she had decoded, by day 4, as a filing instruction. He had not explained the system. He had simply begun using it, and she had simply begun understanding it, and neither of them had commented on the fact that this was unusual. He tested her still. The tests had become more sophisticated. On day 7 he had handed her a Russian-language shipping manifest and asked for a summary by noon. She delivered it at 11:43. On day 9 he'd given her 40 minutes to prepare a briefing on a company she'd never heard of before a meeting she hadn't known was scheduled. She prepared 6 pages and a 1-paragraph executive summary that he read twice, which she knew because she'd watched his eyes track back to the top. He never said well done. He never said good work. What he said, and only occasionally, was correct, delivered in the tone other men reserved for higher praise, and she had recalibrated her expectations accordingly and found, somewhat to her own private amusement, that she had begun to value it precisely because it was rationed. She was thinking about none of this on Thursday morning when the package arrived. It appeared on her desk between 8 and 8:15, in the window when she was in the supply room reprinting a contract that had been sent with the wrong header. It was a small box, maybe 8 inches square, wrapped not in the anonymous brown paper of a courier delivery but in a dark green that was clearly intentional. No card. Her name was written on the top in block print that was not Devereaux's handwriting. She had memorized his by day too, but had the quality of someone writing on someone else's behalf with someone else's instructions. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Petra, who appeared in the doorway with coffee and a carefully maintained expression of knowing absolutely nothing. Petra. Did you see who left this? I was getting coffee, said Petra, with the serenity of someone who has chosen, deliberately and permanently, not to get involved. Marlowe opened the box. Inside, nested in black tissue paper with the seriousness of something being presented at auction, was a mug. It was white. It was ceramic. It was utterly ordinary in every respect except for the text printed across it in large, confident sans serif letters, which read, "The world's okayest employee." She stared at it. The mug stared back. She picked it up and turned it over. On the base, in smaller text, was a URL for what appeared to be a novelty gift website, and a small sticker that read "dishwasher safe," which she found, in context, extraordinarily funny. She did not laugh. She pressed her lips together and looked out the window and looked back at the mug and made a decision, very deliberately, not to look at the inner office door. She looked at the inner office door. The blinds were angled in a way that told her nothing, which in her 11 days of reading this office told her everything. She set the mug down on her desk with precise care, exactly where a normal person would put a normal mug they intended to use, and she made a pot of the good coffee, the one she'd sourced from a Guatemalan supplier after discovering that the previous building contract was providing something that tasted, in her private assessment, like ambition and disappointment, and she filled the mug and she worked. She used it all morning. At 12:34, she carried a folder into his office for a signature and set it on his desk and stood with her hands loosely clasped, same as always, and she watched him read the document with the focused economy of a man who processed language faster than most people processed images. He signed. He handed it back without looking up. She took it. She was at the door when she said, conversationally, as though she were noting a change in the weather, "The mug is excellent quality. Very accurate." A silence. "The world's okayest employee," she continued, thoughtfully. "I thought it was a strong choice. Specific. Measured. The kind of performance review that really captures nuance." Another silence, but she had become, over 11 days, something of a scholar of his silences, and this one had a different texture from his usual ones. His usual silences were controlled, architectural, weight-bearing. This one was suppressed. It had edges. "I've had the same mug on my desk at home for 6 years, he said, finally, his voice carrying the careful levelness of a man who has decided to commit to the bit without appearing to commit to anything. "It's motivational." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the document he'd just signed, or appearing to. The line at the corner of his mouth had returned. It was, she was fairly certain, slightly more pronounced than its previous appearances. "Yours says okayest," she observed. "Mine says okay." I noticed the distinction. "Yours is newer," he said. "The technology has improved." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had built an empire on silence and precision and the studied projection of a person who felt nothing unnecessary, who tested people the way geologists test rock faces, looking for fractures, and she felt something shift in the room. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been visible to anyone passing the glass. Just a small, quiet movement, the way a temperature changes in a space when two people in it decide, without discussing it, to lower their guard by exactly 1 degree. "Thank you for the mug, Mr. Knight," she said. She kept her voice professional, which cost her something. He turned a page. "I don't know what you're referring to, Miss Solstice." She left his office and sat back down at her desk and drank her coffee from her world's okayest employee mug and stared at the city doing its vast, indifferent, beautiful thing outside the glass, and she allowed herself, privately, where no one could see it, a smile that took up her whole face. She had not smiled like that in longer than she could accurately recall. She filed the feeling carefully, the way she filed everything, noting its location, its contents, the particular way it resisted easy categorization, and she returned to work. At 3:15, she discovered the second mug. It was in the supply cabinet, behind the printer paper, wrapped in the same dark green. This one read, "World's Okayest Boss." There was a post-it on it, in block print that was not quite Devereaux's handwriting, which by now she understood meant it was exactly Devereaux's handwriting. It said, "In case the technology continues to improve." She put it in her bag. She took it home. She put it on her kitchen shelf next to the single good plant she kept alive through discipline rather than affection, and every morning for a long time afterward, when she made her coffee before the commute, it was the first thing she saw. She never mentioned it again. Neither did he. It was, she would think later, the first real conversation they ever had. She found it on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow. Betrayal, in Marlowe's experience, had the decency to arrive on harder days, gray Mondays, late Fridays when everyone's attention had softened at the edges. Tuesday was industrious and plain and did not seem like the kind of day that changed things. And yet, it was her third week. The work had deepened in the way that work does when you're good at it and the person directing it has begun, incrementally and without announcement, to trust you with more of it. She had graduated from calendar management and contract logistics to something less defined and more interesting, a role that existed in the negative space of Devereaux's organization, doing the things that needed doing precisely because no one had thought to assign them to anyone. She read. She synthesized. She prepared briefings that were never attributed to her and recommendations that arrived on his desk as her analysis and left his office as his decisions, and she found she did not mind this. She had never needed the credit. She had always needed the work. The quarterly ledgers arrived on Tuesday morning in a locked file transfer from the internal accounting division, 12 folders, color-coded by subsidiary, representing the financial architecture of an empire that was, on paper, a diversified holdings company and was, in practice, something considerably more textured than that. Devereaux had asked her to cross-reference 2 of the subsidiary accounts against an external audit report that had flagged a rounding discrepancy. Clerical, most likely. The kind of thing that happened when 2 different accounting systems spoke to each other imperfectly. She made coffee. She opened the files. The rounding discrepancy took her 11 minutes to find and resolve. It was clerical, as anticipated, a decimal formatting issue between the European and domestic accounting software that had been compounding quietly for 2 quarters and amounted, in total, to a correctable error of $412 across 3 accounts. She noted it, drafted the correction memo, and was about to close the files when something stopped her. It was not a number. It was the rhythm of the numbers. She had a gift for pattern, had always had it, the way some people have perfect pitch or a sense of direction that never fails. Numbers had a grammar, a cadence, and she heard it the way other people heard music. These numbers were playing something slightly off-key. Not wrong. Not obviously wrong. Just a half-step flat in a way that would slide past anyone who wasn't listening for it, which was precisely the kind of off-key that was never accidental. She went back to the beginning of the file and started again. The third subsidiary. Knight Capital Ventures, a mid-sized arm of the holdings group that managed private equity placements across the Midwest. Clean books, well-maintained, the kind of orderly financial record that took consistent effort to produce. She had been through enough corporate accounts to know that orderly books were not inherently suspicious. But she had also been through enough to know that consistently orderly books that showed no variation, no human error, no quarter where someone had miscategorized a travel expense or duplicated a vendor payment, were something else. Something curated. She made a second pot of coffee. She did not notice herself doing it. The pattern, once she found the thread of it, unwound with the cold inevitability of a proof reaching its conclusion. Over 14 months, someone had been skimming. Not crudely, there were no large withdrawals, no phantom vendors with obvious names, no transfers to flagged jurisdictions. This was practiced and patient and intelligent, the work of someone who understood that the best theft is the kind that mimics the texture of normal. Small amounts, distributed across multiple line items, each one defensible in isolation. A consulting fee here. A facilities adjustment there. A licensing cost that was 10% higher than the contracted rate, repeated monthly, the overage siphoned sideways into a holding account that appeared in the ledger as a legitimate internal transfer. 14 months. 12 line items. A total, by her calculation at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, of $843,000. She sat back in her chair and looked at the number for a long moment. $843,000 did not leave an organization like Knight Holdings without help from inside it. It did not navigate the accounting architecture without someone who understood that architecture intimately. The consulting fees had been authorized. The licensing contracts had been signed. Every single transaction had a name attached to it, and not the same name each time. They rotated, which was clever, distributing the trail across multiple authorizing signatories so that no single person's fingerprints were too thick on any single transaction. But the rotation had a rhythm. She mapped it on paper, old habit, she thought better in ink, and the rhythm resolved, after 20 minutes, into something she could follow. The authorizations rotated across 4 names, but the account that received the overage was always the same. And that account, traced back through 2 layers of internal transfers, resolved to a name. She stared at the name. She read it 3 times, because she was not the kind of person who acted on a first reading of something consequential. It was a name she recognized. A name that appeared in meeting minutes and organizational charts and the framed team photograph on the wall of the second-floor conference room, in which the man in question stood 3 people to the left of Devereaux Knight with the relaxed confidence of someone who had been there long enough to feel permanent. Marcus Hale. Chief Operating Officer. 14 years with the organization. The man who, according to Petra, had interviewed every one of Devereaux's previous secretaries and sent each one upstairs with a reassuring word and no indication that he had reasons of his own to prefer they didn't last. Marlowe looked at her notebook. She looked at the files. She looked at the city outside the glass, which was doing its usual impassive thing, entirely indifferent to the fact that she was sitting at a desk on the 32nd floor having discovered that the second most powerful man in the building had been stealing from the first for over a year. She thought, carefully and without drama, about what to do next. The obvious answer was to walk into the inner office and tell Devereaux immediately. She considered this for approximately 45 seconds and set it aside. She had one thread. One thread, however compelling, was not a case, it was a hypothesis, and she had enough respect for the situation, and for Devereaux, and for what 14 years of loyalty would mean to a man like him, not to bring him a hypothesis. She would bring him a proof. She closed the visible files and opened a new document. She began to build the case the way she built everything, from the ground up, each layer load-bearing, nothing included that couldn't support weight. She pulled the vendor contracts and cross-referenced the authorization dates. She pulled the licensing agreements and compared them against the original negotiated rates. She pulled 2 additional quarters of records that hadn't been in the original request and found the same pattern, older, fainter, like the first practice strokes of someone learning a new skill. At 5:55 p.m., Petra put her coat on and said goodnight. At 6:30, the last of the floor cleared. At 7:14, she became aware, without looking up, that the light in the inner office had not gone off. She gathered her notes. 12 pages, annotated, cross-referenced, a single clean summary at the front. She looked at the name at the center of it, Marcus Hale, 3 people to the left, the relaxed confidence of someone who felt permanent, and she felt something she could only describe as the specific, cold sorrow of being right about something you'd hoped you were wrong about. She knocked once on his door. "Come in." He looked up when she entered, and something in her face, some quality of stillness that was different from her usual stillness, more deliberate, more weighted, made him set down his pen before she reached his desk. She placed the folder in front of him. "I found something," she said. "You'll want to read it before tomorrow." He read it twice. She had expected once. He processed everything faster than seemed reasonable for a human being, but he read it twice, and the second time was slower than the first, which told her that the first read had been for the facts and the second was for something else. Confirmation, maybe. Or the particular, private work of a man absorbing information that costs something to absorb. She sat in the chair across from him, the one she had claimed on her first morning, and she did not speak and did not look away from the window behind him. The city was doing its late evening thing, the lights multiplying, the lake going black at the edges, Chicago arranging itself into something that looked, from 32 floors up, almost gentle. She had learned that cities were like people in this way. Distance softened them. You had to get close to understand what they actually were. He closed the folder. The silence that followed was unlike any of the silences she had catalogued before. Not a test, not a negotiation, not a suppressed reaction. This one had weight to it, the dense specific weight of something structural shifting, and she sat with it and let it be what it was. 14 months, he said, finally. At minimum. I only had access to 6 quarters. The pattern in the earliest record suggests it may have started before that. Marcus has been with me since the beginning. He said this not as a defense and not as a contradiction. Simply as a fact he was placing on the table beside her other facts, measuring them against each other. I know, she said. Another silence. He stood, which she had not expected, and moved to the window. He stood the way he always stood, completely, no part of him uncertain about its placement, and he looked at the city with an expression she couldn't read from the angle she had, which was only his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the barely healed cut at his mouth that had faded now to a thin dark seam. The account, he said. Legitimate on the surface. 2 shell layers. Whoever set it up was patient and knew the architecture well enough to make it look like an internal transfer protocol. And you found it in an afternoon. I found the thread in an afternoon, she said, carefully. I spent the rest of the time making sure I was right before I came to you. He turned from the window then, and looked at her, and the filtered light of the city behind him did something complex to the shadows in the room, layering them, making the space between his desk and the window feel compressed and particular. She was aware, not for the first time, of how late it was. Of how empty the floor was. Of the specific quality of an office after hours, when all the professional scaffolding that structured the daytime, the other desks, the ringing phones, the constant managed choreography of a working organization, had been removed, and what remained was just the room and the people in it and the actual, unmediated distance between them. She remained where she was. She was very good at remaining where she was. You were right to wait, he said. It came out quiet and direct, without the slight performative edge that acknowledgement sometimes carried in his voice. This was simply true, and he was saying it, and she felt it register somewhere below her sternum in a way she did not analyze closely. I wasn't sure you'd think so, she admitted. I would have been furious, he said, if you'd come to me with a thread. He moved back to the desk but didn't sit. He stood on his side of it, and she was on hers, and the desk between them was a very large piece of furniture that was suddenly, for reasons she declined to examine, doing insufficient work. I would have been wrong to be furious. But I would have been. I know that too, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. This was not unusual. They had been looking directly at each other since day one. It was practically the organizing principle of their professional relationship, but this particular instance of it went on slightly longer than was structurally necessary, and in the extra seconds something happened that she could only describe as a mutual recognition of a thing neither of them was going to name. "Have you eaten?" he said. The question was so far outside the established grammar of their interactions that she actually paused before answering. "No. There's food in the case conference room. The afternoon meeting ran long. There'll be leftovers." He moved toward the door, and then paused, and said, without quite looking at her, "Bring the folder. There are things I want to go through." She followed him down the corridor, past the framed page she still hadn't gotten close enough to read, past the team photograph where Marcus Hale stood 3 people to the left with his permanent feeling confidence, and into the case conference room, which was long and dark except for the ambient light of the city through its western wall of glass. He turned on one lamp. Not the overheads. One lamp, on the credenza at the side of the room, which gave everything a low amber quality and made the city outside look like a painting of itself. There were sandwiches, somewhat diminished, and a bowl of fruit that hadn't been touched, and a coffee service that had been off for hours. He located a bottle of water, set it in front of her without comment, and took the chair across the long table, though not at the far end, she noticed. Somewhere in the middle. Closer than the room required. She opened the folder between them. They worked. This was the thing about him, she had found, that no amount of reputation or mythology had prepared her for. He was extraordinary to work with. The intelligence was not a performance and not a weapon when it was aimed at a problem rather than a person. It was simply a very fast, very precise instrument that moved through complexity the way water moved through architecture, finding the load-bearing points intuitively. He asked questions she hadn't thought of. She had answers he hadn't anticipated. It went back and forth like that for nearly an hour, and the sandwiches disappeared, and the city rearranged its lights outside, and at some point the folder was less between them than beside them, a shared object rather than a transmission. At 9:47, she reached across the table to turn a page and her hand crossed through the edge of the lamplight and he watched it, briefly, with an attention that was not about the page. She felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure, not dramatically, not with any outward sign, but as a physical fact that the room had registered even if no one in it was acknowledging it. "The authorization chain," she said, returning to the document. Her voice was exactly as it always was. She was very good at this. "Yes," he said, returning with her. He was very good at it too. But the temperature in the room had changed by 1 degree, same as it had on the day of the mug, and this time neither of them lowered anything. They simply sat with it, professional, precise, absolutely focused on the task, and allowed the other thing to occupy the room alongside them, unnamed and unaddressed and present the way the city was present outside the glass, vast and luminous and too large to ignore. At 10:23, they had what they needed. She gathered the papers and straightened them and did not look at him while she did it, and he stood and turned off the lamp, and for 2 or 3 seconds the room was lit only by the city. She was acutely, specifically aware of where he was standing. She suspected he was acutely, specifically aware of where she was standing. Neither of them moved. Then he said, "I'll have a car take you home," in the tone of a man resuming a language he understood well. And she said, "Thank you," in the tone of a woman who understood it equally well, and they walked back down the corridor in a silence that was doing a very large amount of work. At the elevator, he stood back while she pressed the button. The doors opened immediately, as though the building had been waiting. "Miss Solstice," he said. She turned. He was standing just outside the elevator's reach, his hands in his pockets, the corridor light doing its complicated work on the planes of his face. "Good work," he said. Not correct. Good work, fully articulated, nothing rationed. The first time. She held his gaze for exactly as long as she trusted herself to. Good night, Mr. Knight, she said. The doors closed. She faced forward. In the polished steel of the elevator doors, her reflection looked back at her with the composed, unreadable expression she'd spent years perfecting, and she studied it, and she knew, with the same cold clarity with which she'd identified the pattern in the ledger, that it was no longer entirely true. 3 days passed in which neither of them referred to the folder, the conference room, the lamp, or the elevator. This was not avoidance. Avoidance had a particular texture, a deliberate rerouting of attention, a slight excess of normalcy that announced itself by being too smooth. What happened instead in those 3 days was more like the behavior of two people who had silently agreed to let something settle before deciding what to do about it. The work continued. The silences were the usual silences. She delivered his 8 a.m. briefing and he read it and said correct, and she returned to her desk, and the professional architecture of their arrangement held its shape the way good architecture does, not by being rigid, but by having been built well enough to absorb pressure without showing it. On the 4th morning, she arrived at 7:56 to find Petra was not at her desk. This was unusual. Petra arrived before everyone, including Marlowe, and her absence had the quality of a removed load-bearing wall. The space felt structurally different without her in it. There was a note on Marlowe's desk in Petra's handwriting that said simply, "Called away. Building will manage." Which Marlowe suspected was Petra's way of saying that Marlowe would manage, and that Petra had decided this was fine. At 8:04, Devereaux's intercom clicked. "My office." She brought her notebook. She also brought the folder, because she had learned to read his timing, and his timing this morning had the quality of a conclusion being reached. He was standing, not sitting, which she had also learned to read. When he sat, he was processing. When he stood, he had already processed and arrived somewhere and was waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. There were 2 other people in the office. She recognized them from the organizational chart she had memorized in her first week, a habit, not an assignment. Lena Varga, General Counsel, a compact woman in her 50s with silver hair and the watchful economy of movement that came from decades of saying exactly as much as necessary and nothing more. And beside her, a man Marlowe knew by name only, Callum Reed, head of internal security, who had the physical stillness of someone whose job required him to be underestimated and who was, she suspected, very rarely underestimated twice. They looked at her when she entered. She looked at them. No one spoke. Devereaux said, "Close the door." She did. "Sit down." She sat. She did not open her notebook. She set it on her knee and rested her hand on it and waited with the quality of attention she reserved for situations where every detail would matter. "Lena and Callum have read the folder," Devereaux said. "As of yesterday. I've had 48 hours with it. We've been building secondary verification on the account trail, independently of your analysis, to confirm the methodology." He paused. "It confirmed." Lena Vargas said, without preamble, "Your sourcing was clean. The chain of documentation is sufficient for legal action if we choose it, and sufficient for an internal resolution if we don't." She said this the way people stated weather conditions, factually, with no implication that the facts should be surprising. Callum Reed said nothing. He was looking at Marlowe with the focused, non-hostile attention of a man taking a detailed inventory. "Marcus has been placed on administrative leave this morning," Devereaux continued. "The stated reason is a compliance review. He doesn't know the scope of what we have. That won't last, he'll figure it out within the week, but it gives us time to move the relevant accounts and close the access points before he can respond." He stopped and looked at her with the full, specific attention he usually parceled carefully. "Which means that the COO position is, as of today, vacant. And that certain functions that ran through that office need to be redistributed immediately." Marlowe looked at him. She said nothing. She was building the shape of what he was telling her and she wanted to have it completely constructed before she responded to it. "I'm not offering you the COO role," he said, and she noted that he said this without apology, which she respected. "You've been here 4 weeks. I don't operate on sentiment." A pause. "What I'm offering you is a seat at the table that doesn't have a title yet, because I've found that titles have a way of defining the edges of a role before you understand what the role actually needs to be." Lena said, "In practical terms, you'd be working directly with Devereaux, myself, and Callum on anything that sits at the intersection of operations, legal exposure, and internal risk. You'd have access to the full financial architecture of the organization." "Everything." She said everything in a specific way that meant she was not being rhetorical. Callum spoke for the first time. His voice was lower than she'd expected and very measured. "I've been doing this a long time. I'm good at reading people. You found something in an afternoon that a forensic accountant we retained 8 months ago didn't find in 6 weeks. He tilted his head slightly. "I'd like to know how." "I listened to the numbers," Marlowe said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, in the way of someone filing a satisfactory answer. She turned back to Devereaux. He was watching her with that diagnostic attention, reading her the way she read documents, looking for the thing beneath the stated thing. She held it without flinching, because she never flinched, and also because she had something to say and she had decided she was going to say it. "I want to understand something," she said. 4 weeks ago you were designing silence tests for a secretary position. Now you're offering me access to the full financial architecture of a," she chose the word carefully, "complex organization. I want to know if this is because of what I found, or because of how I handled what I found." The distinction mattered and she needed him to know she knew it mattered. He looked at her for a long moment. "Both," he said. "But if you'd come to me with a thread instead of a proof, the answer would be neither." She sat with that. It was exactly the right answer, which was itself information. "There's a condition," she said. Lena's expression registered something that might have been appreciation. Callum's did not change, which she suspected was its own form of appreciation. Devereaux said, "Tell me. I need to understand the full scope of what I'm walking into. Not the organizational chart version. The actual version." She held his gaze. "I've been reading the shape of this organization for 4 weeks and I'm not naive about what some of those shapes mean. I'm not asking for a moral accounting. I'm asking for an accurate one. I won't work blind and I won't work with information I have reason to believe is incomplete." The silence that followed was the kind that happened when a room full of careful people was deciding something simultaneously and without conferring. Devereaux said, "That's not a condition. That's a requirement I was going to make of you anyway." He straightened slightly. "I don't bring people into this circle and keep things from them. I've found it's inefficient." A pause. "And dangerous." She nodded. She opened her notebook to the first clean page. "When do we start?" "We started," said Devereaux, 4 weeks ago." He moved back to his desk and sat, which meant he had finished processing and they had arrived somewhere and the room had caught up. "There's a briefing at 10. You'll sit in. Lena will send you the background this morning. Callum will walk you through security clearance this afternoon." He looked at his desk, a dismissal of sorts, though not an unkind one. "You'll need a new office. The one adjacent to mine is empty." She stood. She looked at Lena, who gave her a single nod of the brisk professional variety. She looked at Callum, who was still taking his inventory and appeared to be nearly satisfied with it. She looked at Devereaux. He was reading something, or appearing to read something, and the line at the corner of his mouth was present and doing its usual understated work. She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame, because something had occurred to her. "Mr. Knight." He looked up. "The framed page," she said. "In the corridor outside your office. I've been meaning to ask." Something moved in his expression, brief, private, almost caught. "It's a resignation letter," he said. "Mine. From a firm I worked at before I built this one. I keep it to remember what it felt like to decide." She looked at him for a moment with all of the attention she had. "Good reason," she said. She walked out into the corridor, past the framed letter she could now, finally, stop wondering about, and toward the adjacent office that was empty and waiting, and she felt, precise and clear and unembellished, the specific sensation of a door opening into a room she had not known she'd been walking toward. She went in. She set her notebook on the desk. She looked at the city through the window, which was the same city it had always been, vast and indifferent and luminous. She opened to a clean page and started a new list. The invitation had been on his calendar for 6 weeks, which meant it had been on hers for 5.5. The Hargrove Foundation Gala. Annual. Black tie. Held in the grand ballroom of the Meridian Club on Michigan Avenue, which was the kind of building that had been beautiful for so long it had stopped trying. The foundation itself was legitimate, arts endowment, children's education, the kind of philanthropic infrastructure that Chicago's upper architecture used to give its money somewhere visible and respectable to go. The guest list was a precise cross-section of the city's financial, political, and social weight, which meant it was also, by extension, a map of every alliance, rivalry, and unresolved tension in Devereaux's professional world. He had attended alone for the past 3 years. She knew this from the archive of his calendar, which she had read the way archaeologists read strata, not just for what was there, but for what the layers revealed about the life being lived through them. He told her she would accompany him on a Wednesday, at 4 p.m., in the same tone he used to relay scheduling information. "The Hargrove Gala is Saturday. You'll need to be at the building by 7. He had returned to his reading before she'd had the chance to formulate a response, which she suspected was intentional. He had learned, over 8 weeks, that giving her processing time was strategically inadvisable if he wanted something to simply happen rather than be examined from multiple angles first. She processed it anyway, privately, on her own time, and arrived at the conclusion that this was not merely a social engagement. Nothing in Devereaux Knight's calendar was merely anything. The Marcus Hale situation was contained but not resolved. Word moved through an organization the way weather moved through a city, quietly, then all at once, and she had noticed, in the 2 weeks since Marcus's administrative leave, a particular quality of watchfulness in certain senior staff. People waiting to see which way the weight would fall. People who would be watching Saturday night with careful, measuring eyes. She needed to be ready for that. She intended to be. She did not tell him any of this. He already knew it. That was the thing about working in close quarters with a very intelligent person, the redundancy of explaining things they'd already arrived at. She had come to find this efficient rather than unnerving, which itself told her something about how much had shifted in 8 weeks. On Saturday she arrived at the building at 7:05 wearing a gown the color of deep water, midnight blue, structured at the shoulder, with a simplicity that was the result of significant expense and the knowledge that the room they were walking into would be looking for every possible thing to read. She had pulled her hair back in a way that was elegant without being severe, and she wore one piece of jewelry, a single gold cuff on her left wrist, which had been her mother's and which she wore on significant occasions without quite articulating to herself that this was what she was doing. Devereaux was in the lobby when she stepped out of the elevator. He was in black tie. Of course he was in black tie, it would have been structurally impossible for him to wear it badly, and he was speaking quietly with Callum, who was not attending the gala but was clearly running a final briefing. He looked up when she crossed the lobby and the briefing stopped in the way that briefings stop when something has entered the room that reorganizes the room's priorities. Callum, to his credit, recovered immediately and said something in a low voice that Marlowe didn't catch. Devereaux responded without looking away from her, which Callum appeared to find entirely expected. He said, when she reached them, "You look like someone who knows exactly what she's walking into." "I do," she said. "Good." He offered his arm in the practiced, unhurried way of a man who had been formally educated and had never decided whether he considered this an asset or an imposition. She took it in the practiced, unhurried way of a woman who had been in enough rooms to know when the gesture mattered. The car was waiting. The Meridian Club received them at 7:38, which was neither early nor late, the precise timing of people who understood that arrival was a statement. The room was already populated to the point of orchestrated fullness, the kind of crowd that had been curated rather than gathered, where every conversation was also a negotiation and every introduction was also an assessment. She felt the shift the moment they crossed the threshold. Not dramatic, nothing so useful as a room going quiet, but a gradual, rolling reorientation of attention, the way a compass needle moves when something magnetic enters its field. People noticed Devereaux the way they always noticed him, with the slightly heightened alertness of those in the presence of someone whose goodwill they had reason to value. But they noticed her differently. The calculation was visible, briefly, on the faces of those who hadn't learned to hide it well enough. Who is she? What does she represent? What does it mean that she's here, beside him, in that particular way? She let them look. She had prepared for exactly this. Devereaux moved through the room with the contained authority of a man who had long since stopped finding these events interesting and had retained the habit of attending them purely as a function of strategy. He introduced her, simply, without elaboration, as Marlowe's Solstice, which was itself a statement. No title. No qualifier. The absence of explanation in a room full of people who explained everything was its own very clear signal. She watched how people responded to his silences and spoke into the ones that needed filling. She redirected two conversations that were drifting toward territory she had assessed, from Callum's briefing notes, as currently sensitive. She caught the eye of a city alderman whose relationship with the Knight Holdings development arm was in a delicate phase of renegotiation and said exactly 4 sentences to him that were warm and specific and left him looking slightly more settled than he had before. She did all of this without appearing to do any of it, which was the point. At some moment near the end of the second hour, she became aware that Devereaux was watching her work. Not conspicuously. He was in conversation with a man from one of the legacy banking families, and the conversation appeared to have his full attention, and it did. He was not a man who gave partial attention to anything. But there was a quality to his peripheral awareness of her that she had come to recognize over 8 weeks, a slight orientation of his presence in her direction that functioned as its own form of attention. She said something that made the alderman laugh. It was a genuine laugh, unguarded, and 2 nearby conversations paused briefly in response to it, and in the pause she felt the room make a small collective adjustment, not to her specifically, but to the configuration of her and Devereaux, the unit they presented, the particular coherence of 2 people who moved through a space as though they had privately agreed on its geometry. Later, on the balcony that ran along the building's north face, she had needed 4 minutes of cold air and he had appeared beside her with the uncanny timing she'd stopped being surprised by. He stood at the railing looking out at the city and said, "The alderman." "Renegotiation," she said. He needed to feel like an equal rather than a supplicant. 4 sentences was enough. And Hargrove's wife. By the East Bar at 9:15. She'd heard something about Marcus. Not the details, the shape of it. I confirmed nothing and made the shape smaller. He was quiet for a moment. The wind came off the lake with its usual January indifference, and she felt it move through the carefully constructed architecture of her evening and didn't mind it. "They're reading us as a unit," he said. Not a question. "Yes. Is that a problem for you?" She considered the city for a moment, its lights, its scale, the way it continued doing its vast and indifferent work regardless of what any individual within it decided. "No," she said. "Is it a problem for you?" He turned his head and looked at her with the full, specific attention that she had stopped being able to receive entirely without feeling it. "No," he said. The wind moved between them and around them. Below, Chicago glittered with the impartial beauty of something that had been here long before either of them and would be here long after, and they stood in the cold together with the comfortable, unspoken ease of 2 people who had been many things to each other in a short time and were, both of them, beginning to understand that they were not finished yet. She pulled her wrap closer. He did not offer to help and she did not need him to, and the fact that he understood this was, she thought, the most intimate thing that had happened all evening. They went back inside together. The room rearranged itself around them, the way rooms did. Neither of them spoke about the balcony afterward. Neither of them needed to. The warning came on a Monday, which felt more appropriate than Tuesday had. It arrived not as a threat, nothing so legible, but as an absence. At 8:47 a.m. Marlowe opened the secure server that housed the Marcus Hale documentation and found 3 files missing. Not deleted. Moved, with the particular forensic tidiness of someone who understood that deletion left a cleaner trail than relocation, which meant they also understood that she would notice, and had moved them anyway, which meant the message was not "I have covered my tracks." The message was "I know you're watching and I want you to know I'm watching back." She sat with this for 63 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Callum. He answered on the second ring. She described what she'd found in 4 sentences. He said, "Don't touch anything else on that server. I'll be up in 3 minutes." He was up in 2. They worked quietly and quickly, Callum at her terminal and Marlowe at the secondary workstation pulling access logs, and within 20 minutes they had the shape of it, not the full picture, not yet, but enough. The server had been accessed remotely at 3:14 a.m. through a credential set that belonged to a junior analyst in the compliance department, a 26-year-old named Reyes who had been on compassionate leave for 2 weeks following a family bereavement and whose credentials, Marlowe noted with the cold specific sorrow she was coming to recognize as the feeling of being right about something terrible, had been used with the fluency of someone who had been given them rather than stolen them. Marcus had been planning this longer than the administrative leave. The leave had simply changed his timeline. "He's not done," Callum said, with the flatness of someone stating physics. "No," said Marlowe. "He's escalating." The files he moved contain the authorization chain. Without them the documentation is circumstantial. "We have copies. He knows we have copies." She looked at the access log again. "He's not trying to destroy the evidence. He's trying to create noise. Enough competing documentation, enough ambiguity in the chain, and any legal proceeding becomes a question of which version the right people choose to believe." She paused. "Which means he has the right people already arranged." Callum looked at her. "You should tell Devereaux." "I'm going to. I want one more thing first." She pulled the access log back 3 weeks and looked at it with the listening attention she reserved for numbers and, increasingly, for situations that had a rhythm she could follow if she was quiet enough. It was there. Faint, but there, a pattern of access times that suggested not random opportunism but coordinated activity, multiple touch points across multiple systems, the digital equivalent of someone who had been walking through a building at night, testing doors. They had not been working alone. She printed the log. She marked 4 entries. She looked at the timestamps and cross-referenced them against the building's after-hours access records, which Callum had standing clearance to pull, and she did this quickly and without drama, and when the correlation resolved into a name she looked at it for a long moment and felt something shift in the room that had nothing to do with temperature. The name was not Marcus Hale. It was one of the 4 rotating authorizing signatories she had identified in her original analysis, one she had flagged as peripheral, a secondary actor, someone following instructions rather than issuing them. She had been wrong about that. Or rather, she had been right about the role but wrong about the direction. This person had not been following Marcus. Marcus had been following them. The original source was older than Marcus's 14 months. It was older than she had thought to look. She took the printed log, the marked entries, and the cross-reference, and she walked to Devereaux's office and knocked once and went in without waiting for an answer, which she had never done before, and he looked up from his desk with an expression that registered the departure from protocol and sharpened immediately. She put everything in front of him. She stood back and let him read. He read it once. He did not read it twice. He looked up and said, "Reyes's credentials. Given, not stolen." Which means there's been a relationship there long enough to establish trust. Reyes may not know how the credentials were used, or may know exactly. The signatory. Not a follower. The architect. She met his eyes. The Marcus Hale situation was a branch. This is the root. He was very still in the way that she had learned meant the most intensive processing was happening, the stillness of a system running at full capacity with nothing left over for surface movement. She waited. She was very good at waiting. Then he stood, and reached for his phone, and stopped. His eyes moved to the window behind her. Something in his expression changed, not much, but enough. She turned. The outer office was visible through the interior glass panels flanking his door. It was 10:23 a.m. on a Monday. The floor should have had its usual populated hum. Instead it had a quality of stillness that was wrong in the same way the server access had been wrong, the stillness of something that had been arranged rather than arrived at naturally. Callum appeared in the corridor outside the glass moving fast, which she had never seen him do, and the fact of it resolved the situation before he reached the door. He came in and closed it. Building security flagged an anomaly in the elevator system. Someone cycled the executive floor access credentials in the last 40 minutes. Maintenance is locked out. We're working on it. His eyes went to Marlowe. There's also a car that's been idling on the parking level since 8:30. Registered to a shell company. He paused. Same shell company as one of the accounts in the ledger. The room went very quiet. Marlowe looked at the interior glass. She looked at the corridor beyond it. She looked at the printed log in Devereaux's hand and thought about the root, not the branch, and about the person who had built this slowly and patiently across longer than any of them had thought to look, and she understood, with the same cold clarity that had served her from the beginning, exactly what was being attempted and what it would require to stop it. The documentation was the target. The physical copies she had made, stored per Callum's protocol in the secure cabinet in her adjacent office. The digital copies on the server were already compromised. If the physical copies were taken or destroyed, the evidentiary chain collapsed into exactly the noise Marcus had been trying to create, and the root would walk away clean and restructure from whatever safe distance it had already prepared. She looked at Devereaux. "The cabinet in my office," she said. He was already looking at her. He had already understood. "No," he said, and it came out with a quiet force that was different from his usual quietness, something under the control of it that she hadn't heard before. "The building access is compromised. Callum can't move people fast enough without knowing how many there are." She kept her voice level. Not performing calm. Simply using it, the way she used all her tools, because the situation required it. "I know where everything is. I know what to take and what order to take it in. I can be in and out in 4 minutes. Marlowe." Her first name, unqualified. He had never used it like that, without the professional prefix, without any scaffolding around it. It landed differently than she had imagined it would, which told her she had imagined it, which was information she set aside for later if there was a later. "I know what I'm doing," she said. "That's not what concerns me." She held his gaze. Somewhere below them the city continued its vast indifferent work, same as always, utterly uninterested in what she decided. She thought about the first morning and the 31-second silence and a standoff that had set the terms of everything that followed. She thought about the mug on her kitchen shelf. She thought about a framed resignation letter and what it felt like to decide. "For minutes," she said. "Lock the corridor behind me." He looked at her for 3 seconds with the full unguarded attention he rationed so carefully, and in it she saw the thing he would never say under these conditions because he was not a man who said things under conditions that didn't allow him to mean them completely. "Callum goes with you," he said. "Agreed." She turned to go. His hand caught hers, briefly, once, a single point of contact at her wrist, just above her mother's gold cuff, and then released. She did not turn around. She took the contact and its release and walked out the door with Callum behind her, into the wrongly quiet corridor, toward her office and the cabinet and the 4 minutes that would determine what any of this had been for. Behind her, she heard Devereaux pick up the phone. She did not look back. She never looked back. But she carried the warmth of his hand at her wrist all the way down the corridor, like a lamp held low against the dark, and it was enough. The documentation survived. So did she. These were the two facts she returned to in the days that followed, when everything else was still resolving into its final shape. The physical copies had been retrieved intact. Callum had been, as she'd suspected from the beginning, considerably more formidable in a corridor than his stillness suggested. The two men they'd encountered on the executive floor had not anticipated her and had made the further error of underestimating Callum, which was the last professional mistake either of them would make for some time. Federal authorities, who had been quietly briefed by Devereaux's legal team in the hours that followed, described the incident in their preliminary report using language that was precise and thorough and entirely absent the texture of what it had actually felt like to stand in a corridor at 10:47 a.m. on a Monday with the building access compromised and the choice already made. The root, as she had come to think of her, was a woman named Elise Cannon, senior partner at the firm that had incorporated Knight Holdings' first subsidiary 19 years ago. She had been embedded so long and so patiently that she had become part of the architecture, a load-bearing wall that no one had thought to test because it had always been there. Marlowe had found her in an afternoon, which Elise Cannon had apparently not anticipated, and which Devereaux, in a meeting with his legal team 3 days after the incident, described in 4 words that Lena later relayed to Marlowe with the delivery of someone presenting a meaningful gift. She found the root. Not my secretary found it. Not one of my people found it. She. The distinction was not lost on anyone in the room. Lena had made certain of that. It was 10 days after before they were alone together for any significant length of time, which was not accidental on either of their parts. The organization needed managing. The legal proceedings needed feeding. The staff needed the particular kind of visible steadiness that followed a destabilization, the reassurance of watching senior people behave as though the ground was solid, which required performing a confidence she largely felt and he never appeared to doubt. They were good at it together. They had been good at it since the Hargrove Gala, and the 10 days confirmed and extended this, and the professional structure held, and she was grateful for the structure because it gave her somewhere to put herself while the other thing waited. On the 10th evening she was in her office at 8:30, which had become unremarkable, cross-referencing the rewritten authorization protocols that Lena's team had drafted in the aftermath. The floor was quiet. The city was doing its patient glittering. She heard his door open across the corridor and then, after a moment that had the quality of a decision being made, a knock at her open door. She looked up. He stood in the doorframe with his jacket off and his sleeves turned back 2 folds, which was the most undone she had ever seen him, and he looked at her with an expression that had none of its usual management in it. Not raw, he was constitutionally incapable of raw, she suspected, but unguarded in the specific way of someone who has decided, finally, to stop spending energy on a particular kind of maintenance. The protocols can wait, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she closed the folder. He came in and sat in the chair across from her desk, the position she had occupied across from his for 9 weeks, and she registered the reversal with the part of her mind that registered everything and noted its significance and moved on. He sat the way he sat everywhere, completely, with the full occupancy of a person who had never needed to make himself smaller in a room. But there was something different in it tonight. Something that had been set down. "You knew I'd try to stop you," he said. "From going to the cabinet." "Yes. You went anyway. The situation required it." "The situation," he said, with a very slight emphasis that wasn't quite irony and wasn't quite tenderness and was in fact precisely the thing between them that had been waiting for 10 days to be addressed, required a great many things. You could have let Callum go alone. Callum didn't know the filing order. 4 minutes with the wrong things would have been the same as 4 minutes with nothing. Marlowe. Her name again, the way he'd said it in the office with the wrongly quiet corridor beyond the glass, unscaffolded, direct, carrying more than its syllables. She looked at him steadily. I knew what I was doing. I know you did. He held her gaze. That's not the point I'm making. She understood the point he was making. She had understood it for 10 days and had been, in the careful deliberate way she managed most things that mattered, waiting for the right conditions to receive it. She wasn't sure the conditions would ever be perfect. She was beginning to think that waiting for perfect conditions was a version of the same avoidance she had accused herself of on the elevator ride home from the conference room, looking at her own reflection and knowing her composure was no longer entirely true. You called me by my name, she said. In the office. Before I went. Yes. You've never done that. No. He looked at her with the full diagnostic attention that had, somewhere over 9 weeks, become something else, something that diagnosed nothing because it had already arrived at its conclusion and was no longer a question. I've been precise about that. Why did you stop being precise? Because, he said, with the careful delivery of a man who had assembled this sentence over 10 days and intended every word of it to be load-bearing, I was watching you walk towards something I couldn't follow you into and I found that my precision became temporarily unavailable. She sat with this. She gave it the full, unhurried attention it deserved. I'm not frightened of you, she said. I want you to know that's still true. Whatever this is, whatever we are, it's not that. I know, he said. I stopped testing you for flinching around week 3. You're aware of that. Week 2, she said. You stopped on day 9. The Russian shipping manifest. Something moved across his face that was the fullest version of the corner-of-mouth expression she'd been collecting since her first morning, wider, less contained, arriving without apparent effort to suppress it. She felt it like a change in air pressure. She felt it in the specific place below her sternum that she had been carefully not examining for 9 weeks. You've been counting, he said. I count everything. You know that. I do. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on his knees, closing the professional distance across the desk in the incremental unhurried way of someone who had decided and was simply now executing the decision. I also know that you came to me with a proof, not a thread, on a Tuesday afternoon 4 weeks into a job you were overqualified for, and that everything that's happened since has been the consequence of that. He paused. I want to know if you've decided what you think about that consequence. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had built an empire on silence and had, somewhere between day 1 and the 10th evening after, begun to be quieter with her differently. Not the silence of testing or withholding. The silence of someone who had found a person they didn't need to perform for and had experienced this as something close to relief. She thought about being unscared. She had told him so on the first morning and had meant it absolutely and still meant it. But she had learned, over 9 weeks, that unscared and alone were not the same thing, and that she had been treating them as synonyms for longer than she could accurately date, and that the error had been expensive in ways she was only beginning to fully account for. I think, she said, carefully, that I walked off an elevator on the 32nd floor 5 weeks before I understood what floor I was actually arriving at. He looked at her. The city looked in at both of them through the glass, vast and luminous and patient. And now, he said. Now I know where I am. She held his eyes, steady and unguarded, the closed book finally open to the right page. I'm not leaving. The silence that followed was the last new kind she would ever need to catalog. She recognized it immediately, not a test, not a negotiation, not a suppressed reaction, not the shared quiet of a late-night work session or the charged stillness of a balcony in January. This silence was an arrival. The specific, irreversible quiet of 2 people who have been moving toward each other across a careful distance and have, finally, closed it. He reached across the desk and she met him halfway, because she always had, and his hand covered hers the way it had in the corridor, except this time neither of them let go. Outside, Chicago continued its vast indifferent work, same as always. The lake held its tideless dark at the edge of everything. The 32nd floor held its light against it, one lamp burning in an office where a woman who didn't frighten and a man who didn't soften had found, in each other, the one thing neither of them had thought to put on a list. On her kitchen shelf at home, 2 mugs stood side by side. The city's okayest employee. The world's okayest boss. She had moved them together, sometime around week 3, without acknowledging to herself that she was doing it. Some things you know before you're ready to know them. She had simply let herself be ready. And just like that, the proof is delivered. The root is exposed. The hand has been held, and neither of them let go. Marlowe walked onto the 32nd floor with nothing but composure and a closed book for a face. She left it as one half of something the city hadn't seen coming. And Devereaux Knight, the ghost king of Chicago, cold as the lake in January, met the one person his silence couldn't outlast. If this story got under your skin, if you felt the tension in every standoff, the warmth in every mug, the weight of everything building in that conference room with one lamp on and the city watching, then you already know what to do. Like this video. It tells the algorithm that slow burn, high-stakes love stories like this one deserve to be found by everyone who needs them. Subscribe to the channel. Because Marlowe and Devereaux are just the beginning. The next story is already waiting behind the next door, and I promise you, it will keep you up past midnight and ruin your morning plans. And drop a comment below. Tell me, were you with Marlowe from the moment she didn't flinch? Or did Devereaux have you from the mug? Because I need to know which side of this silence you were standing on. The vault is open. The next story is waiting. Don't miss it.